Welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast, where we read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. We're going to dive right into a really fascinating book that I think you'll find very stimulating and enriching. Darwinism is a fascinating topic on many levels. On one hand, it's recognized throughout the world as the leading and perhaps the only acceptable theory of how Earth and its inhabitants came to be. Its assumptions permeate the media, popular culture, the scientific community. Yet at the same time, there are millions of people who remain unconvinced of its explanatory power. Some even reject it outright for reasons that are theological, philosophical, and even scientific. Evolution, natural selection, common descent. The press writes stories on hundreds of topics in ways that simply assume a monolithic consensus on these issues among the scientific community. This is often totally innocuous. After all, the press does need a basic canvas of shared assumptions on which to paint, and so a boring and uncontroversial consensus provides that for the story at hand. Yet the truth is thankfully far more interesting and intricate. The scientific conversation over these issues is not like a peaceful pool of undisturbed water, but rather a roiling cauldron of critique and counterattack, not always friendly, and certainly not always intellectually honest. And so I highly recommend Darwin's House of Cards by Tom Bethell. With the eye of an investigator and the explanatory prose of a seasoned journalist, Bethell takes a look at Darwinism from multiple vantage points. He packages up a very readable and engaging overview of the battlefronts in the scientific community, both past and present, regarding multiple facets of the Darwinian paradigm. What follows is a brief overview of some of the topics that he covers, the inconsistencies he points out, and the conclusions that we both draw. So here we go. We're just going to dive into some of these. Number one, the origin of life question. So natural selection, which is commonly referred to as survival of the fittest, is often used to explain the origin of life. But the reality is that this concept assumes self-replicating entities. That's the whole point of natural selection. And so it's necessarily, or I guess by default, downstream of the question of origins. So logically, there's got to be some other explanation for life's origin than Darwin's signature concept. It's also unequivocally true that nobody has yet to observe natural selection actually resulting in one species transforming into another. This is immensely significant, but it's often overlooked or outright ignored. So this will come up again later in the review. Number two, common descent. This is the idea that all living things descended from some common ancestor. In other words, we're all in this big, massive family tree, and at the very top is the very first organism. And so therefore, we are all tangentially related. I won't go into the details, but Bethell cites a variety of problems with this view, and he does write that, quote, "The verdict on common descent must be unproven. The evidence for it is weak. The genetic code is not universal." Number three, he talks about natural selection. So the problem with natural selection is that it's used as sort of the one-size-fits-all solution for literally any problem that's posed to Darwinism or to evolution. But modern research continues to show that natural selection, which really just means minor genetic mutations that accumulate over time, is far more likely to be destructive to cellular organisms than to construct new functionality. And this is key. So one of the ways that we've been able to test this out is by studying bacteria, which have a really short life cycle, and they replicate so quickly that we have been able to observe literally millions of generations and monitor them for genetic mutation really in real time. So genetic mutation is how bacteria develop antibiotic resistance, for example. And Bethell quotes biochemist Michael Behe, who argues that bacterial resistance is, quote, "good evidence that mutations can do little more than break things, and occasionally those breaks have a beneficial side effect. But this process certainly isn't building anything." So that's really interesting. As I mentioned a moment ago, natural selection is pulled out sort of anytime they need to explain away really any objection to evolution. It's sort of the skeleton key of the Darwinists. So here's a longer quote from Bethell, but it's just really fantastic. Quote, has any researcher ever been able to show such, quote, indefinite departure from the original type? And then this is sidebar. That's basically he's referring to a shift from one species to another. So back to the quote. If not, then what reason do we have for accepting Darwin's theory as true? Meanwhile, natural selection is perpetually affirmed by proponents as the mechanism built into nature that can account for whatever is observed to exist. Its details do not have to be observed. Whatever exists, a natural selection explains it. Darwin continues to be the hero of materialism because he, quote-unquote, discovered an unguided mechanism that can be brought on stage to explain everything that exists in biology without having to resort to the supernatural. So far, however, there is no evidence to show that this process is actually responsible for the fantastically diverse array of species that populate our world. And then here's the money sentence at the end. He says, natural selection functions in the realm of philosophy, not science. Number 4, Bethell talks about extinction of species. So here we have natural selection as the troublemaker again. The way it's used basically amounts to circular reasoning. And here is Bethell quoting public intellectual Norman Macbeth. Quote, it is all too easy to say that a species becomes extinct because it failed to adapt, while establishing its failure to adapt only by its coming extinct. So it just ends up being in a circle and sort of self-affirming on either side, which is sort of ridiculous. Number 5, he talks about variation within species. So we've all heard about the Galapagos finches, right? Or the moths that change colors to match the polluted climate, or the wolves who evolved to be white in order to blend in with the snow and thus survive. There's a handful of examples like that show up in all the textbooks, etc. The problem with these examples is that they're used to make leaps into assertions that this process of minor variation within species also creates new species. But the existing research clearly indicates that species adapt to conditions within a specific range of their quote-unquote mean or benchmark state, and they never go beyond those bounds and become something new. So even when human intervention prompts and guides the variation, so like animal breeding, it has failed to exceed its inherent boundaries. So to me, this is more evidence of the classic and really still unanswered distinction between microevolution, which virtually nobody denies, and macroevolution, which is a jump between species. As the environments change, these species that have shifted to adapt inevitably revert back to their starting point. So we've never seen anything new come out of this process. That's the key point here. The scientific term for this is unlimited variation, or also indefinite departure. And here's what Bethell writes about this. He says, it has not yet been observed. If it had been, we would never stop hearing about it. It has been deduced by assuming the truth of the theory that it is meant to confirm. The continued advocacy of indefinite departure by biology departments amounts to the triumph of ideology over science, or perhaps, we might say, to the triumph of hope over experience. And then a little bit later he says that, quote, what the evidence shows us is not indefinite departure, but oscillation about a mean. Number 6, there's a handful of other topics that I'm just going to cobble together. He dives into convergence, homology, the fossil record, objections from intelligent design theory, and then he also goes into problems that are posed to evolution by information theory and what experts call complex specified data. And this gets pretty esoteric, but I'll try to give a brief explanation. So as an example, the mathematical probabilities involved with randomly generating even one of the proteins needed for life, that it just really boggles the mind, and it should immediately create hurdles for the average person that you would find as and identify as insurmountable. But here's a quick summary of information types. So you've got complex information, and this is something that is statistically unlikely, but not necessarily designed. So this is something like a particular hand of cards that gets dealt, or 20 letters arranged in a particular order. Specified information actually contains meaning or real content in a message. So specified complexity, which is information that is both statistically unlikely on its face and which contains meaning, is so unlikely to arise randomly that it should be considered statistically impossible. Or you might say, to believe that it happens due to unguided natural processes requires a certain measure of faith. So number 7 is methodological naturalism. So Bethell finally gets to a topic that I have read quite a bit about over the years and really wrestled with where to land on. And here's one of the fundamental questions. Does science, by logical necessity, have to be tied to philosophical or methodological naturalism, or can they be extricated from each other? So you've got theologians like John Walton who have argued that one can and must embrace methodological naturalism in order to even, quote-unquote, do science at all the while keeping it separate from the philosophical variety. And Walton would reject the philosophical kind, but adhere to the methodological kind. But I have long worried that this simply cedes too much ground to the secular evolutionists. So here's a couple questions for you. There are obviously many outspoken and pretty viciously anti-theistic Darwinists out there in the public conversation, and one has to ask, are they that way because they hold to evolution, or do they hold to evolution because they are anti-theists? So for Darwinists, once the materialist philosophy is assumed and moved past, then of course evolution is true, and natural selection is the default answer to any objection, no matter how strong. Evidence doesn't really matter because any other answers are dismissed out of hand a priori. Here's what Bethell says. Here's how he puts it. Quote, at this point, Darwinism becomes little more than a deduction from a philosophy. The science is redundant. There's no need to bother with information theory, enumerate mutations, whether favorable or unfavorable, or fuss about fossils. Darwin's theory is embedded in its underlying materialism. Now listen to this quote from Francis Crick, who was one of the discoverers of DNA. Quote, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are nothing but a pack of neurons, unquote. So, to me, the main reason that Darwinism continues to resist the critiques brought on by reason and evidence is that it's fundamentally grounded in philosophical naturalism and materialism and not observable phenomena. So really that part is a veneer. So to me, the fight here is not really over evidence, but it's about epistemology. As new research in biochemistry and genetics continues to pile up mountains of counter-evidence against natural selection and evolution, the responses by fully committed Darwinists have become increasingly ridiculous. So they will grasp at literally any straw, no matter how unlikely, to avoid any explanation that might undermine their secularism. So you have people like Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins at different times have both posited what amounts to an alien seeded our planet explanation for the origin of life, which really doesn't answer the question. It just kicks the can of the origin of life dilemma further back in time. So it's a cop-out, and they should be embarrassed to use that sort of an argument. Biologists initially scoffed at this supposed junk DNA that fills up most of our cells, and really they used it to claim vindication of natural selection, saying that, really this is what we would expect to see if the cells developed this way, accumulating all these, junk or bad mutations that don't serve a function. This is just, the dead weight, the dross of natural evolutionary processes. And really they've only been embarrassed as further research continues to reveal that this quote-unquote junk DNA really does have really complex function and incredible value to cellular life. So that continues to grow year over year. So I will close with one final observation. It's really fascinating to note that later in his life, Darwin himself appealed to theological justifications for the correctness of his theory. And really, they weren't really unique. They were just sort of standard theodicy type objections, the typical problem of evil type stuff. It was clear that Darwin was looking for a reason not to believe in God. But the key point is that teleology, or the concept of something having a purpose, was there in his theory from the very beginning. It was never purely about science or about following the evidence wherever it led. Some Christians, like the biologos crowd or theologian John Walton, who I mentioned above, they attempt to separate the science from the teleology and from the purpose and from the philosophical naturalism and the materialism that too often accompanies it among mainstream secular scientists. As I noted above, I've wrestled with that and whether I think that separation can actually occur or whether it should. Or whether natural selection is just totally inextricable from materialism. For a while, I was at least open to being convinced that they could be kept separate, but I am increasingly convinced that they cannot. Why should we cede epistemology to the Darwinists when their edifice is crumbling? There's no reason to give away the store. We should continue to critique Darwinism, even if we just do so on its own terms and according to its own premises. And we should just wait for the dominoes to fall. It's only a matter of time. So Bethell's book provides a really straightforward and readable account of the major flaws that are inherent to Darwin's theory and the significant challenges that are posed from without. So I highly recommend it to skeptics and to adherents of Darwinism alike, anybody who wants to expand their understanding and get a broader view of the arguments involved, really anybody who's interested in science or philosophy or both. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Please check out the show notes for this episode at closemindedpodcast.com/5, and you will find the text of this book review as well as links to some other reviews on related books that I've written on this topic. Now go forth and read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. See you next time.
I wish upon you truth when all you feel is doubt. I hope you know that an open mind still knows when to shut things out. I wish upon you a brave heart that will always rise above. But most of all, I